There are two different primary types of concepts, or to be clear, there are what we think of as concepts, and then there are what we may call concept-forming concepts, or simply logical concepts. Under the former, we may place ideas that we know and whose meaning we learn from social or habitual use, a car, an animal, a rock. Under the second, we may place our use of those same concepts to shape contexts or construct complex ideas. You can say that it's here where we begin to Socratize, to move past conventional and traditional meaning, though we may, as we often do, fail to note this, as we do when we describe as a vehicle the mechanism by which the blood is siphoned through the arteries and carried to the organs, knowing that the blood's job is to carry oxygen, nutrients, and other things. This is an example of concept-forming concept use. The expression vehicle seems to appear all on its own. We are not particularly amazed by it, ingenious though our use of it is. Also note the other things that we overlook. Read over the sentence, and with a little contemplation, you'll be awestruck by the intricate artifice through which we've constructed our sentence.
Exactly. Siphon is Greek for pipe. Siphon. Mechanism is also Greek for device or machine. Mechani. Organ, Greek as well, organon, originally meant musical instrument before use in anatomy. Nutrients, to nourish, comes from Latin, pronounced as nutriens or nutrier.
What this shows is our language expressions, before they are just common expressions for certain processes, are something else. Morphological operations that use language to modify objects at the ontological level. We make judgments and linguistic applications based on analogy, that because a vessel and a pipe share the same underlying function, the same expression can be used for both. Or we can say that their meaning can be used interchangeably. A water pipe can be called a vessel for that structure we call building, inasmuch as the expression siphon, native to pipe, can be used in an anatomical sense. The import of each term can be safely transposed into the other and be more informative even than its original meaning alone. Furthermore, observing something like a financial transaction and the way in which an engine propels a vehicle, we come to infer that money in the first instance and energy or fuel in the second are both describable as mechanisms in their respective schemes. We see that fuel and money are the conditio sine qua non, without which those operations would not be. In the expression mechanism, borrowed from a totally different context, is satisfied that sense impression we generally find in causality. Hence the root meaning, contrivance, or means. Also telling are the connotations which the term originally had of trickery or cunning, which on reflection, and beyond the ethical dimension, seems to articulate a certain obscurity in the way some outcome transpires, an obfuscation, indirectness, or disconnect in regards to how some otherwise normal process unfolds. The expression ex machina comes to mind. Almost as if money, when called a mechanism for transaction, becomes contrary or contradictory to some natural way of doing transactions. The point is that we have transitioned from a conventional, ready-made use of language to a constructive way of using it. Now, the latter of these is what we call a concept-forming concept. Those are concepts that we use to model phenomena, as we saw in the foregoing examples. It uses a faculty that identifies similarity in widely divergent processes. It doesn't extrapolate based on superficial similarities. It actively unifies domains wherein the terms used are applicable. It observes contexts and generalities. Thus, the terms it ends up lifting from one area and applying to another is what a concept-forming concept is, and when used in this sense, it becomes something that belongs to a higher category of relation. It no longer has any meaning in that sense, but an import, something that, rather than tells, connotes, like a mathematical functor that maps objects and morphisms in one category to objects in another, while preserving the relationship between them. The kind of intellectual operations we presuppose in this morphotic treatment of language is really the same kind of thinking we find in mathematics, as Leibniz notes. The same precision found there is also demanded here. We're having to involve a larger circle of analytical operations in analyzing the contextual import of words, whether it's organ, mechanism, a word which we read is originally linked to the act of cutting, or writing, also linked to carving or scratching. We glean a strong sense of instrumentalism or utility, and this can be understood to reflect, as some scholars agree, a certain anthropic principle, a certain intellectual typology of human beings. Because when we transition over to the equivalents of those same words in other languages, we obtain distinctly different expressions.
Absolutely. Many scholars note this, though it's not as popular a thought in mainstream scholarship as it should be. Take Benjamin Lee Horf's conception of linguistic relativity, the idea that all observers are not led by the same physical evidence to the same picture of the universe, unless their linguistic backgrounds are similar, or what others of the likes of Trendelenburg and Gompers contended, that the categories of Aristotelian logic themselves, the categories that gave us metaphysics, classical physics, analytical philosophy, and Boolean algebra, cannot be studied apart from the peculiarities of the Greek language. The late George Steiner shows that translation is a hermeneutic motion that involves more than a simple equation of words, that is, of finding in one language its analog in the other, but that it's a more inclusive psychological operation. It's beautiful how he put it. He says, "It is an operative convention which derives from a sequence of phenomenological assumptions about the coherence of the world, about the presence of meaning in very different, perhaps formally antithetical semantic systems, about the validity of analogy and parallel."
Writing, which in the Indo-European case is linked to cutting or carving, we find in Arabic to mean establishing, in the sense of formulating a rule or a law. Or the word organ, which we said meant instrument, specifically a musical one, maps to the Arabic udu, which literally means member or module. Or the word mechanism, which in Arabic is aliyah, which etymologically speaking is slightly more nuanced because we see here a modification of the definite article prefix alif lam by addition of the letter ya, which commonly denotes continuity or persistence, as well as ta, which adds a subject or predicant to the overall word. Why is this nuanced? It's because the sufficiency of the prefix as an expression of the idea of mechanism shows a certain emphasis on the bare act of being, the precondition for some condition, modality prior to some mode. It's very close to Husserl's expression of epoche, suspension of the natural attitude, insofar as this is an activity in itself. Contrast this attitude to the instrumental sense found in the Latin or Indo-European version, and you see at once a natural continuity. The Arabic variant articulates episteme, whereas the Latin articulates techne, and you will find this across many different examples. We can say that this shows the relation between two different anthropic principles. And I think this is what Heidegger means when he distinguishes between readiness at hand and presence at hand. Now take word with its cutting or carving origin and compare it to the Arabic variant kelima, and you immediately see the same difference we found with organ. Kelima in Arabic is a close variant of the verb kallama, which is the act of speaking or talking. Now this same word is used as a determiner, every, kul or kullama, every time. or when prefixed with a definite article, el-kull, comes to mean everything or everyone. The precise scope depends on whether the word is used in the third or the first person. If in the first person, then we're talking about everything in relation to the subject in question. If in the third, then everything in relation to the object in question. It's interesting to note that the expression kull in Arabic has the same function as the universal quantifier of predicate logic.
Great analogy, totally agree. Universal quantification, symbolized by for all, is a way to declare that if an object fits into a specific category, it must also have a particular feature. For example, saying all x are y means every single x follows the rule of being y. All birds have wings. For every x, if x is a bird, then x has wings. It's like recognizing something if we think of recognition as based on a prior association. Thus, the recognition is a way of subsuming the new case under the precedent.
If we take as our domain the context of ignition or waging war, then the determiner, kullama, universalizes any possible form of activity that may take place under it. The subject is a dynamical inhabitant of that context. What's the actual sense or general import being conveyed here? On reflection, we find accentuated that sense of transcontextual being or successiveness that we find in the prefix alif lam, that epistemic sense, which we said is linked to Husserl's epiche. It's quite interesting that the terms word and every should be used synonymously, because the successiveness of speech, as embodied in word succession, is not here distinguished from successiveness of being, which the distributive determiner articulates. What the Latin sense of word instructs is not, in Arabic, speech per se, but the subject thereof. The subject that permeates the domain of what's being spoken, the extension of subjectivity with the speakable, the subject's co-inhabiting the concept which the words are expediting, hence the repurposing of kelima, word, as a distributive determiner. It's the subject that's doing the segmentation, and that permeates all these different cases of use, not the word per se. What's continuous or active is not the word, Arabic shows, but its speaker, and the object of speech. What it stresses is not the word that's momentarily spoken, but the subject matter in which a multitude of such words are contained. Thus what's successive is that being which expedites them, because it's the subject that holds the context or logic of word construction. Thus word is treated as an instance of the same succession which the term every universalizes or expands for us. The difference is the same as that between some predicate and the process of predication, between an expression like formula and the noun formulation, whereby the successiveness or temporality of the concept is emphasized. The Arabic version is a strange return from that Latin active carving to the subject thereof, from a sense of technique or poiesis to theoria or praxis. Arabic, one might say, is theoretical in its most fundamental ontic disposition by comparison to the more practical or instrumental Indo-European or Latin.
Sorry, let me add something here. If speaking a certain language imposes upon us certain speech patterns, then perhaps this is due to the nature of the language itself. Certain categories and phrases found in one language are often lacking in another. This isn't a simple lack that can be filled in with a quick alternative. It's like a mathematical function is missing, a function that would help solve a major problem in physics. Imagine quantum mechanics without Planck's constant. Unthinkable, right? Well, such is the case in language. You begin to understand here why Aristotle's work on logic was so crucial. He literally quantifies and formulates the basic semiotics for all the hard sciences. Hard to believe that in Einstein's mass-energy equivalence lies or lingers some Aristotle. But it's true. The generative grammar of one language may lead to ideal constructions, which will not be in another language. In Arabic, there's this, I don't know how to put it exactly, a kind of lack of boundaries as to how a certain expression may be used. Words and their content are easily shaped to give all the meaning of which they are capable. I read in Cassirer's Philosophy of Symbolic Forms that they have somewhere in the ballpark of 5,744 names for camel in Arabic, varying according to sex, age, and individual characteristics, special terms for the male and female, for the foal and the adult, and for the subtlest gradations within these classes. I mean, this is totally exemplary of the Arabic speech pattern. Those new words for camel, by the way, are not neologisms. They are bound, logically, by the general ideal form or eidetic concept of camel. In other words, they're natural, organic derivations of it. I found this in a more technically rigorous form in the Quran.
This reflective exercise serves as a background against which the analysis of Quranic terms can be conducted. For Quranic Arabic is simply a more radical, more conscious and technical operation of the Arabic speech pattern. But we must always bear in mind this tendency which seems, from numerous examples, to be truly remarkable and characteristic of this language, the emphasis on subjectivity and upon predicability, the empirical subject, let's say. To take an example, the subjective appropriation of some objective descriptions, the use of ard, earth, to mean satisfaction or content, or iron to mean limits, or color to mean lenient or accommodating. This is a dominant linguistic trend in the Quran, and what's intended to be shown here is not so much the unrestricted or unlimitedness of fluency, though this be the case, but the opposite, the fact that expression or articulation is restricted to the logical parameters of the concept or principle peculiar to the word used. It's more pragmatism and practicality than poetry in that modern sense. The word is not personalized or appropriated in the sense which we usually take it, but rather, in using this word beyond the boundary of its common application, we are importing an order or defining a specific approach or framework. Extrapolation, in this sense, is synonymous with mathematical discovery. When we find a rule to apply in a new domain, like finding out that differential equations can be used to model motion and phenomena that involve change, or group theory to model quantum phenomena or taxonomy, a new realm of possibilities laid open for us as a result. It's precisely in this sense that extrapolation takes place in those cases in the Quran. The word is a model we use to convey some idea, and by modeling some case through the word, we are really interpolating a certain order to things. Think of it as a heuristic or paradigm, and let's extend this to say that a word is always paradigmatic in its application, not automatic. Hence the prominence of metaphorical extension in the Quran. But the kernel of Quranic logic and generally of Arabic is found, strangely, in a definite article. The definite article we find is similar to, if not directly is, a postulate. It declares or encodes the principle of concept formation that's generally true of the language in question. We indicated this to be predicability, or subjectivity in Arabic. This can be seen in the strange transcontextual power that a given word has as we see in the Quran. The same word that means to walk is used to mean secret or even passerby or traveler, or the word for male is used to mean recall or remember or revelation. You can see the unusual broadness of linguistic import from just one or two examples. In Arabic dominates the logistis as opposed to the logos, which we find to be the object of contemplation in the Indo-European or Latin counterpart. Think logos in Plato's sense, or nature in Bacanian epistemology. This is what explains the aforementioned broadness of linguistic import, because what it captures is not some schema or system, necessarily, which are expressive of the logos, but the intellectual voyager, the rational subject that subsists within a domain which we describe as the logos. It's essentially idealism as a default mode of experience. The rationale for this is found in a definite article. The idealism that characterizes a subject here is transmuted onto the word, so that the word itself becomes a kind of subject, or to put it differently, the subject, preserving his logistist status, becomes an ideologue. This device situates meaning not in meaning as such, but in meaning making, not in the rigidity of what's meant, but in the malleability of application and intention, malleability in itself. This is because we're not talking about a concept that happens to be applied in this or that familiar context and sense, but about an underlying evolving speculum, a kind of active poiesis in Heidegger's sense. Think of it as a way of judging an idea in terms of that context in which its application would be appropriate or felicitous.
Pretty well put. Let me add to it. The Greek logos, as demonstrated in Plato, points to some realm of eternal objects, objects of which those on earth are at best a pale copy. The subject, Plato in this case, approaches the logos as an external reality to be grasped through systematic inquiry. It's a world out there, so to speak. The Arabic intellectual culture, by contrast, seems to revolve around the logists, not the object of contemplation, but the active, calculating, rational subject itself. The logists is the intellectual voyager, as you put it, the one who navigates and actively engages with concepts as living tools rather than eternal objects. It's funny, there's this part in Samuel Alexander's Space, Time, and Deity, first volume, where Alexander responds to Hegel's notion of concrete universals. Other cases of a qualitative sort may mislead similarly, he writes, like Hegel's example of the rain, which is the same water in the air and in the ground which it wets. Alexander responds that the effect is something quite dissimilar. The falling water is distributed differently from the resting water. In the action of digitalis on the heart, not even such accidental simplicity is to be found. The effect need not be like the cause, and rarely is. And it never is identical with the cause. That would be uniform motion, and the universe would be a blank. That about sums up the difference between a logistus-based approach and the logos-based approach. But the logistus-based approach, as you said, creates the need for its own foundational domain. If the Greeks have the logos as their ontological ground, the Arabic tradition constructs what you called the speculum, not a mirror or instrument as we learn from conventional use, but the very domain or space of speculation itself. I like that twist. It's like saying datum to refer to data singly, or medium to refer to media, or referendum for referring or reference. The case ending brings the expression back to its proper subject or root. You used speculum in a similar sense to say the proper subject of speculation. This domain sense of speculation, an evolving field where contextual appropriateness emerges and where meaning-making unfolds, is indeed something quite different. I suppose this is where Alexander was when he saw the falling water distribute differently from the resting water as he described it, and where the effect seemed quite dissimilar to the cause. To add one more thing, this sounds eerily like Husserl. What we call the speculum resembles what Husserl calls life world, a central concept in phenomenology. The basic idea goes, there's an all-embracing world horizon. This horizon forms the underlying structure of all experience. The seed of this world is the subject. In fact, it's a purely subject-based world, in the sense that it's accessed through a subject-oriented, reflective mode of contemplation. It's something bigger and more inclusive than Newton's Machina Mundi or Kepler's Horologium Mundi, both of which liken the world to some perfect mechanical system. The life world, you can say, is their analog, just, rather than leading to mathematical physics, it leads to a kind of historical world, a Jungian kind of picture of the world. No less rigorous than mathematical physics, just different. Something to be captured through poetry and heavy, deeply intellectual and strategic employment of language devices, figures of speech, metaphors, or pattern symbolics, as Horff calls it. We see this in action in the Quran. Think about it. Why would a people refer to a ship by the same name, by which they call the celestial system of stars and constellations above, or use the word for name to refer to the heavens?
To nature, or we say compared to experiment or experience.
We don't use differential equations to model motion because we choose to, but we do so because no other method is better equipped to handle this phenomenon. Also because we know that differential equations are not useful only in modeling the fixed laws of electrodynamics, as in the case of Maxwell's equations, but that nature always contains phenomena that necessitate or call for the use of differential equations as a method. It's this continuous sense of applicability that we're referring to. Differential equations, as a branch of mathematics, then, has a meaning and being that goes beyond any immediate case of use. It's valued as a program. This is precisely where Arabic would employ the definite article. It applies it to otherwise stale and rigid words so as to imbue them with modality and universal import, giving them that sort of being that the subject himself possesses. Prefixing through the definite article is actually a way of saying that wherever the conditions are such that, by their very nature, stipulate the concept is already in circulation, or has a being that's continuous, irrespective of where and when those conditions may arise. To put it differently, when the definite article is used in Arabic, it is used in an a priori sense, to say that concept X is prevalent insofar as conditions Y are prevalent. This is why the Quran often begins its chapters with the definite article, usually appending it with a letter like Mim or Ra. To understand this, recall what we said about universal quantification. Think also of Kant's third analogy in the Analogies of Experience series of the Critique of Pure Reason, specifically the principle of reciprocity and simultaneity. The definite article as a chapter opener defines the epimorphic scope of that transcendental idea which the chapter simplifies. The idea, it says, is as important in this chapter, as indispensable in this chapter, as it is in any other chapter. The Cow, the title of chapter 2, walks us through the story of the rise of a society, the then downtrodden children of Israel, from Egypt, and the vicissitudes which this emergence encounters, and how Moses led this movement. The cow is a symbolic device that refers to the process of self-cultivation, and this process pervades not just every chapter in the Quran, but every story of every chapter in the Quran, insofar as those stories presuppose this device, and embody, essentially, the task which God had ordained for man. There's no story in the Quran whose figures aren't engaged in self-cultivation. This device also spans the very method of storytelling. in conveying this process from the eyes of different people and from different perspectives. This necessitates, as we see, a transcontextual framing of stories, and what the definite article is chiefly trying to do is impose as a rule a transcontextual understanding of them. The definite article there symbolizes you, the reader, as the logistes of the poetic object which the chapter is synthesizing. You are to move, so this method dictates, between those contexts wherein the cow device appears. To go from chapter 2, for example, Moses' request that his people find the yellow cow, to Joseph's interpretation of the king's dream in chapter 12. Or to go from Moses' tribulation and eventual exodus from Egypt to Abraham's renouncing of his people and his departure, and see those features as underlying the same principle. It's in this regression from one case of the Quran to another by the mediation of the poetic device that the definite article encodes. But this must happen as you are mainly reading chapter 2. Your transition into chapter 12 or any other chapter wherein this device is used should only be done with the intention of giving more context, more meaning to the cow device in chapter 2. That is, to broaden its symbolic import, and therefore your understanding of it. Thus the idea that the definite article is a postulate, that it has an analytical value, or that, as we put it, invokes the logistes, which we contrast with the logos, the domain transcending transcontextual subject, is what the Quran demonstrates, and that is ultimately and fundamentally the Quran's quintessential reader. When we read verses containing the rhetorical question, Alam tara, did you not see? It's not addressing the Prophet per se, the person to whom the Quran was first revealed, but yourself, the logistes, the proper critical reader of the Quran who comes to understand those structural aspects of the book. The critical reader who comes to understand at a deep level and therefore is able to reconstruct through imagination those events which the rhetorical question suggests. Or you can say that it's indeed the Prophet who's being addressed here, but only insofar as the quintessential or ideal reader had been the Prophet, and by extension can be any reader who approaches the Quran as the Prophet had. By being the exception, the Prophet established a rule that makes what's pertinent to the Prophet, what had been true to the Prophet, true to you. In other words, God addresses you directly because in holding the book in the first place, you are embodying the Prophet. There is a subtle difference here that we must first make between the definite article that prefixes a particular word and the definite article that prefixes a verse or a chapter. The one we find in the beginning of 13 of the 114 chapters applies the same logic to those chapters. This definite article expands the import of those chapters to cover the Quran at large. Inasmuch as a definite article applied to a word widens its import and gives it the greatest interpretive and metaphorical extensity that a word can logically bear, the poetic concepts, as we call them, that form the transcendental topic of those 13 chapters are now to be considered as principles that organize and dictate the logical structure of the Quran at large. By transcendental topic, we mean it in the Kantian sense of a doctrine of the location of concepts, a systematic way of determining where, in which cognitive faculty, a concept properly belongs to avoid philosophical confusion. It's a map for assigning concepts to their correct domain. This is precisely the same function which the definite article serves in relation to those 13 chapters. We have concepts that help organize and structure our approach to the Quran at large. Think of it as a schema of classifying Quranic concepts, of saying that whatever idea we encounter in the Quran will definitively fall under one of those 13 categories, and subsequently, The general structure or logic of one of those categories is to be used to give context to it, to understand it as part of a specific architectonic plan within the Quran. Okay, if set theory is the mathematical study of collections of objects, sets, and their relationships, and if their function is to provide a unified framework to define almost all mathematical concepts, and by consequence, if without it, modern math and its applications would lack coherence, then those 13 chapters are the sets of the Quran, into which any Quranic object, so to speak, can be reduced. We reference set theory because this reasoning, i.e. the organizational schema, is essentially set theoretic.
Kant's transcendental topic? I think I know where you're coming from. You're saying that those 13 chapters whose titles are prefixed with the definite article are like sets in which the relation for all x, px is true, holds. In biological taxonomy, for example, we try to summarize a diverse group of species by subsuming them under a handful of general classes, making it easier to classify, study, and understand them. It's the same when we index books and divide them into chapters or sections. We do this so as to synthesize and distill a vast agglomerate of ideas into manageable portions susceptible to targeted critique and study. The same principle applies to those 13 Quranic chapters. They are, in some sense, parameters within which the Quran at large, and all those ideas scattered throughout it, can be understood systematically. If we define a parameter as a limit or boundary that defines the scope of a particular process or activity, then we're looking at the perfect definition for not just a verse, but the very medium of versification, the domain of the logists. Because the construction of the verse itself must have some underlying motive, a didactic, intellectual, or instructive motive. In this way, we can articulate some specific idea and have its motivation be something else. This calls to mind John Austin's brilliant distinction between locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary acts of speech. Those are moods that govern metalinguistic speech, like Frege's distinction between sense and reference. In what sense is a specific expression meant? What does it really refer to? What's the intention here? You know, the old philological question that troubled hermeneutical scholars like Schleiermacher, Vico, and others. How do we know this is what the author meant? How do we know what went on in the author's mind as he composed those words, now that 1,000 years have lapsed? Is there a metaphysic for this stuff? One that allows us to analyze intention and language moods as rigorously as, say, mathematics or any of the exact sciences? Exactly the question which those 13 chapter titles are approximating. Answering those hermeneutical questions, nay, the very question itself, presupposes a science of a transcendental sort, a knowledge of human cognition, of the Platonic human, the general invariant principles that govern the human genus at the cognitive level, outside of any particular time and context. This naturally leads to the striking realization that there is a typology for what may motivate or underlie a verse or a chapter thematically, a deep consciousness as to the universal tropes that loom over it. Since we're talking about the motive that underlies a verse, the word motif comes to mind. A science of motifs? Imagine that. Those 13 chapters must be exact themes, rather, themes that are as exact in their use as are the propositions of Euclid or the categories of Aristotle. Thinking about it, this is implied in the Quran, specifically in Joseph's dream interpretations, the birds eating from the breadbasket held over the guy's head, or his prediction of an economic cycle of 7 alternating years of austerity and cultivation. The other case is the man under whom Moses apprenticed in the 3rd story of the cave chapter. How exactly did he know what was really going on in that ship which he vandalized, or the boy which he killed, or that there was a treasure beneath that wall which he razed? Clairvoyance? Yes, but not magic, much like how we can imagine them asking us, "How did you know what's going on the other side of the world right now?" And us answering, "The internet, a technology we developed that harnesses radio waves to transmit information instantaneously across vast distances." It's simply a case of them having developed a scientific understanding of something of which we're totally ignorant. If I may answer it, I would say that Joseph approached those dream scenarios with those transcendental categories as an active interpretive tool. He presupposed them, that's how he derived them. The same with the man, he used the same categories which those 13 chapters formalized to glean what was happening. But as you can imagine, this method varies in complexity because the categories themselves are subject to combinatorial operations of progressive intricacy. You know what? In both those cases, Joseph and Moses' instructor surfaces the term ta'wil, which this critique leads me to think pertains to this method of, let's say, metonymic analysis, a method for interpreting cases of this sort. The hermeneutical question, "What did the author mean?" harkens to the meaning, the elusive meaning that can be arrived at by way of this method. As you see, the meaning may be, and often is, entirely independent of the parochial intentions of the author, because its source is Platonic, and so are its exact laws of unfolding, emergence, and transformation. The object of ta'wil is called ru'ya, the same word by which God addresses the prophet, who we said was the quintessential reader of the Quran. Alam tara. Did you not see? Seeing here is interesting. It's the kind of seeing that's a seeing through to the proper transcendental sense of the object sought. The Quran distinguishes this perceptual kind of understanding by the word basar, the faculty employed when one seeks to understand those transcendental ends that underlie situations, if by situation is understood the meaningfulness of an interaction in which a human is involved. The expression tara brackets the human ethos that imbues that situation and immediately defers its meaning to that stage, basira, that's arrived at through the process of ta'wil.
If every Quranic object, i.e., concept, is to fall under one of those 13 sets, then it implies that its author would have had to factor in not only every word or concept, but every syllable and combination of syllables, all the way up to the fully formulated verse and chapter, and the corpus at large. This architectonic system would have assigned every unit its precise place in the general corpus, such that the chances of finding a randomness is equivalent to finding randomness in the general scheme of nature. The vastness and complexity of this operation naturally leads to the realization that the author of the corpus must be the same as the author of the universe. Noteworthy here is the fact that the definite article is external to the concept, any concept for that matter, and is applied to it as a modifier that extends the axis of application beyond the conventional meaning, much like the imaginary unit extends the dimensions of a number.
Love the analogy. I got an awesome example for you. On a certain flight plan you purchased, it's stipulated that the luggage must not exceed 20 kilograms. 20 here is a real number because it's being used beyond the counting procedure characteristic of natural numbers. This derivation of a number from the counting series to use it as a rule is exactly what a real number is. Now, when we add a complex number, we are given a limit, namely 20 kilograms, within which limit we can freely operate. The calculus of addition and subtraction conducted to ensure that our value does not exceed the 20 kilogram mark is a function of the imaginary number, because we see that 20 kilograms is subject to the greatest manipulation without its limiting condition being exceeded. The definite article works precisely this way. It is applied to a concept or term, say earth, and in so doing gives a restriction, but a restriction within which an interpretive freedom is allotted. Thus we think less of the definite meaning of Earth as a planet that hosts life in the way we understand it, and more of Earth-like descriptions, metaphors, or figures of speech, but in such a way as to preserve the Earth-like reality of those extensions.
Exactly the same operation, but in language terms. The real part of a complex number adds a restriction for a reason. And so does that part of the definite article that corresponds to it. In different terms, think of this restriction as a limiting condition, without which the word would be unusable or infelicitous, or even indistinguishable from another word. By limiting conditions, I refer to those conditions that a context necessitates or are imposed by a word's application. For instance, the Quran uses the word hadid, i.e. iron, to mean limit, hudud. We infer that this extrapolation is rooted in a formal conjunction with the definite article alif lam, i.e. al-hadid, whereby the limits of metaphorical extension or application are formally defined, and whose result is the figurative expression hudud. What here are the conditions of use then? How is the contextuality of the sentence affected by the interpolation of hudud? We observe how our understanding of the entire verse is transformed. We observe that a limit of conduct was set in this rather critical situation, and it's set as an extreme scenario or boundary condition. Think of what characterizes iron or metal most, and you'll at once see the logic of this application.
Yeah, here's the gist. Iron has an elastic limit, a maximum stress before permanent deformation, or a yield strength beyond which iron begins to deform plastically or bend permanently, or what's called an ultimate tensile strength. A peak stress it can withstand before necking or thinning begins, 50 to 300 megapascals for iron, depending on purity, temperature, and defects, and ultimately, a fracture point.
This is only added out of necessity, as a limiting condition or act, to show what can be accommodated and what cannot. Essentially, it points to the importance and judicial nature of the matter. Think of the expression iron scepter. The question may occur to you, is hudud really to be understood in that metallic sense? I see that in general or vernacular Arabic, its use does not really imply or reflect this connection. The answer is absolutely. We are absolutely to think of the word hudud in that metallic sense. The reason why in vernacular Arabic the term seems unconnected to the material properties of iron is due to the merely referential or deictic nature of vernacular speech, as opposed to the inferential or apodictic sense of poetic or formal speech. In the latter case of Arabic, to understand the term is to justify its application. The law of non-contradiction and identity of indiscernibles are essential requisites here. That is, the conception that there is a reason, a sufficient reason for using this word in this context, as opposed to any other word. Now the logic for this use and the methodical omission and exclusion of any alternative is found in the properties of the word itself. When we speak of this ultimatum of using this to the exclusion of everything else, we are already functioning within the domain of the word itself, and are in the process of justifying or rationalizing this choice by intelligently applying the term, and by shaping the context by way of it. Thus those principles, which we covered extensively in the last 3 videos, codify conditions under which we, ourselves, subsist in using words meaningfully.